Hello, and welcome to the Living Well Show, the program that strives to empower older adults to live life on their own terms. I am your host, Nicolette Hume, the Community Engagement Coordinator for the City of Lake Oswego Adult Community Center. Today's show, we will be talking about family estrangement, particularly that of adult children and their parents. Estrangement within families is certainly something that many keep quiet from others as they are afraid of the stigma that estrangement implies. For parents of adult children who are no longer speaking to them, this estrangement can be seen as shameful and embarrassing, as if this fact says to others that they have done something horribly wrong to their children. However, what you will learn today is not only how common this phenomena is, but what we can do about it. I would like to introduce today Dr. Joshua Coleman, who is a psychologist in private practice and senior fellow with the Council on Contemporary Families. He is the author of numerous articles and chapters and has written 4 books, which also includes his most recently published Rules of Estrangement: Why Adult Children Cut Ties and How to Heal the Conflict. Dr. Coleman is a frequent guest on NPR and a show. His advice will also be seen in that of the New York Times, The Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, Chicago Tribune, and many more. Welcome to the show, Dr. Joshua.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Well, before we begin, if you can share with our viewers how you got into this particular field of family estrangement, because you certainly have a story that is related to this both personally as well as professionally.
Yeah, so sadly, I got into it through the personal. When I was married in my 20s and then remarried in my 30s, but had a daughter in my 20s, and who, when she was in her early 20s, had cut off contact with me for several years, which in many ways was related to my remarriage and having children, and my second marriage and her feeling somewhat displaced by that. So there were a period of a few years where she was upset with me and had cut off contact, and it was easily the most painful, disorienting, frankly awful thing I'd ever been through or hope to go through again. And at the time, there was really nothing written to help me with it. The professional help that I got gave me terrible advice, which only made my situation worse. So over time, I was able to figure out how to kind of repair the hurt from the past and find my way back into her heart. And so now we're very, very close. But it was a really difficult time. And so as a result of that, I wrote my last book before the most recent one, called When Parents Hurt: Compassionate Strategies When You and Your Grown Child Don't Get Along, for parents who are going through an estrangement. And then I wrote the most recent one, Rules of Estrangement: Why Adult Children Cut Ties and How to Heal the Conflict, which was basically everything I've learned in the past 12 years working with thousands of families who are going through this.
And you certainly have, and are definitely an expert in this field. I mean, all you have to do is type in family estrangement, and there you are on some of the
Here I am,
biggest
for better,
news
for worse. Yeah,
sources. It's true.
yeah, no, I'm
But
aware.
the thing is it, as you state in your book, that it is something that people do feel embarrassed about, and especially the parents. It's like this. It's taboo. It's a stigma.
Mhm.
People think that or your peers may think that you may have done something horribly wrong for your child to not want to talk to you, because it just seems like such a violation to that family unit.
Yeah.
So, in your book, you do talk about different pathways to estrangement. Can you share a little bit more about what they are?
Sure. Yeah, you're putting your finger on a very common stereotype is that people assume, well, gee, if an adult child cuts off contact with a parent, the parent must have done something pretty terrible. And in fact, a certain percentage of adult children do cut off contact because the parent was abusive or really hurtful or destructive in some kind of a way. It's not like that doesn't exist. It's just that's not the only pathway to estrangement. Sometimes it happens because the adult child marries somebody who doesn't like their new in-laws and says to the son or daughter, choose them or me, you can't have both. And they're the gatekeeper to not only the adult child, but also to the grandchild, sometimes cutting off very involved grandparents who had been highly involved with their grandchildren for many years. All of a sudden, they find themselves completely cut out of their grandchildren's life. Another common pathway, perhaps the most common, is parental divorce. And that can be true when the children were young, but also true when when the adult children are grown. So we call the gray divorces, which are actually the most statistically common divorce these days. People divorcing in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. That can also trigger an eventual estrangement. Now, why would that be the case? Well, one is it may cause the adult child to blame one parent over the other for breaking up the family home. It may cause one parent to blame the other parent, what we call parental alienation, where they poison the child's love against the other parent successfully. It can bring new people into the child's life at any age, families, stepchildren, new wives, new husbands, new boyfriends, new girlfriends to compete with over emotional and material resources. Finally, in a highly individualistic culture like ours, it can cause the adult child to see the parents more as individuals rather than a family unit that they're a part of. There's a couple more. Shall I go on, or did you want me to take a breath here? It's
Oh,
up to you.
go ahead and take a breath because we are certainly going to get into them. And I will tell
Okay.
you, um, audience, is that his book, I really think there is no stone left unturned in this book.
There's a lot of
It
stones.
covers everything you could possibly think of. And, that term that you brought up, gray divorce, I do find that to be interesting with people like Bill and Melinda Gates just announcing that they are parting ways. Um,
Mhm.
I mean, we hear about people divorcing all the time, but for whatever reason, those two have shocked the world. And there is like some real sadness that people have experienced out there. Um,
Yeah.
with that being said, though, uh, like let's say, I'm not saying that this is them, but I was reading, I think in some publication, but it was talking about how sometimes when marriages like that are over the age of 50 are ending it, that there could be a rate of someone violating the trust in the relationship for it, and like that of infidelity of, there's many different kinds with related to that. And so I can
Mhm.
see within a family where you have adult children that, really feeling violated, that this has taken place, and you've had your own experiences with relationships to have some, thought about it as opposed to being a child or a young
Mhm.
child. Or the other aspect that I've seen with individuals my age is their parents have waited until everyone has left the home, and
Yep.
then bam, mom and dad aren't together anymore. And
Yeah.
it it almost seems more devastating for those adult children than maybe if this happened when they were younger. Is that right? Or I've heard that, but I don't know.
I don't know that it's more devastating. I think it's a different kind of upset or trauma. When you're a young child, you're denied the kind of solidity of the day to day experiences with the parent. The parents deny the solidity and comfort of the day to day experiences with the child. When your parents divorce when you're an adult, you've had that experience for better or worse. If you didn't know that your parents were close to divorce, then that can be very shocking and disorienting. And many adult children say, well, wow, if that was the case, how can I trust my own perceptions? How can I assume in my own marriage that, it's not just going to fall apart and it's not going to be obvious to me or to other people. So I think a lot of parents who are, good, loving, involved parents assume that, okay, well, we did the right thing. We raised our children. We waited till they were out of the house. And then we got divorced, so it's all going to be good. We'll be able to still be close to them. And what they don't realize is that no, divorce, even when children are fully grown, can also become a big wedge in the closeness with the parent and the adult child, and sometimes create a permanent estrangement.
Yeah, I have certainly seen that in, a lot of my peers' families. And the other thing I'm curious about too is estrangement. I mean, it is certainly something that has happened through the ages, but
Mhm.
is it true that we're seeing more of that than ever?
I believe so. I mean, I think if you just look at divorce as a primary cause, divorce rates skyrocketed in the mid 60s, the 1970s. Now they're around 45% of the average couples. And so if you assume, as my research has shown, that divorce is a big trigger of estrangement, it certainly seems clear that there's more estrangements today than there was in the era prior to divorce. But there's also several other factors that cause it. This was the subject of an article I wrote in the Atlantic a few months ago. And that is that the way we think about family today has profoundly changed. You're right. On the one hand, we've always had estrangements, but never before in our history have we thought about them as being an act of individuality and identity and personal growth and the pursuit of happiness. So that's all relatively new. So today, who we choose to include as family is a very personal part of our expression and identity and self-esteem. So that is relatively new. I think the internet provides for a lot of kind of tribal identities, which can be generational as well. It provides the ability for people to get support on forums like narcissistic mothers or emotionally abusive parents, or something like that, where people can kind of bond together and form narratives and identities. So I think the social media, however positive it can be for sharing pictures and keeping families together, it can also be an enormously divisive source as well. The political climate is also can be a source of estrangement, which I don't think was true or as true in the past. So I'm seeing many more families where the parents were voted for Trump, the parents voted for Biden, and now nobody's talking to each other. So I think there's plenty of reasons to assume that the rates are higher than they once were.
Well, you really, and even what you said right there, I mean, we could go a million different directions.
Hours and hours
Um,
and hours. Yeah.
Absolutely. Hey, we could start a support group on Facebook about it, but there probably is already
There are
several
plenty, trust me.
dozens.
Yeah. Uh,
But going back to the part about generational, I mean, it does seem that like my grandparents' generation was very much about keeping that family unit together. Um,
mhm.
Good, bad, horrible,
Right.
anything. It was just, you're still going to talk to that sister or mother or father that has really, maybe in some cases been downright abusive in a really dysfunctional way.
Right.
Um, but then it seems as though the baby boomer generation has kind of become more of that individualist that you speak of and kind of
Mhm.
gotten away from the unit way of thinking. And then, my generation, it's um, very different. Things like what you're talking about is if we're picking our families a la carte. And then we're also
Yeah, that's right.
more um, open to going to therapy and really um, delving into the
Mhm.
events of our life or traumas or what have you that baby boomers and certainly that of the generation before didn't ever really, it's still kind of, there's a stigma around mental health. So I'm
Right.
sure you do see that in your office as well.
No, you're raising an important point, and that is that therapy has become a very powerful part of the story that people tell about themselves. And parents, in many ways, have become much more important than ever in terms of how younger generations think of themselves. And it's as generations very preoccupied with their childhoods and how their childhood affected their present identity. And Sometimes our childhoods really do have a big impact on our identity, but parents are only one factor in many in terms of how people turn out. Sure, it's parenting, it's also genetics, it's also social class, it's also siblings, it's also friends, it's also random good luck and random bad luck. But if you look at the kind of therapeutic nature quality of our society, everything goes back to mom and dad. And what that means is that a lot of adult children are blaming their parents for things that really wasn't the parents either didn't cause or it wasn't the parents' fault, or even if it was somewhat the parents' fault. It shouldn't necessarily be used as a justification for estrangement. It's kind of like, well, you didn't see that I needed to be in therapy, so I don't owe you anything as an adult child. And I just think it's a problematic way to run a society. It's what I call emotional meritocracy, that you sort of have to emotionally earn your way into your parents' life or to maintain it. The parent has to kind of prove their value. It used to be the child's job to earn the parent's love, but increasingly it's the parent's job to earn the child's love and to keep the child's love. And today, nothing maintains that beyond whether or not the adult child wants to maintain that relationship. So that in many ways disempowers parents and overempowers the adult child.
Mhm. Well, yes. I admit my generation tends to be more self-entitled. Um, I apologize on that behalf, but there is some of that. It's a
Well, I mean,
truth,
it's
and
my generation though, Nicolette, that's created it. So I think baby, I thought, the okay boomer meme, this idea where, millennials and Generation Z go, okay boomer, kind of
yes,
like, when boomers are blaming, I mean, it's my generation that caused it. We were so preoccupied with our kids' self-esteem and developing their personalities and their assertiveness. So we can't be too surprised when they're adults and they're like, well, I really want to pick and choose about who to have in my life and who I don't. And that's what you taught me, mom and dad. So it's not really, can't really blame the generation.
I know we do get such a bad rap, but I will say though, families having a lot of children,
Mhm.
having scarce resources, enduring various types of addiction and even abuse. I mean, there was no real
Mhm.
child protective services because it was
Right.
happening next door. There was just so many different ways that families were doing life at that time that I only think it makes sense that the boomer generation felt more empowered to empower their children, so that
Hmm.
they didn't have the same experience. But,
Yeah.
even today, when we see situations on the global scale, like Harry and Meghan and the interview that, went around the world and things like that. Very interesting because even in a situation like that, generations before them just kind of put up their duty and
Hmm.
they're them being, the younger generation, they are seeing it as more of a choice, and
Hmm.
so it really does change things. But another area of your book that you cover is that of mental illness and addiction.
Yeah.
And, you know, when that becomes a problem, now this can fall on both sides of the fence,
Hmm.
with
Sure.
a parent maybe who's an alcoholic or a child who is a drug addict and so on. So,
Hmm.
what do we do, in those types of situations? Is estrangement okay? Is that a part of getting that person to reach a rock bottom to get to recovery? Or that's been the old adage. What would you say about something like that?
Yeah, and to be clear, my position isn't that people should never ever estrange themselves, or if they do, that they're bad people, they're selfish. I think that, ultimately people do have the right to decide who to keep in their lives and who not to. And there realistically are parents who are too abusive or hurtful or unempathic or judgmental in such an ongoing way that it makes it impossible for the adult child to maintain a relationship with them. And certainly to your point, if the parent has addictive or they're alcoholic or they have severe mental illness, that might make it really impossible for the adult child to stay connected to them in a meaningful way. But a certain percentage of estrangements happen because the adult child is mentally ill or has addictive issues. So in that situation, they may blame the parent for things that really didn't, the parent either never did, or they may exaggerate them, or they may have ideas about kind of the way parents should behave that isn't really realistic. They may be more vulnerable to being manipulated by somebody who's really wants to manipulate them against the parent. So what I often advise parents if their child is mentally ill is it's a matter of love and limits. Love because it's not your child's fault that they have mental illness, but limits because sometimes adult children who are mentally ill may create all kinds of difficulties. They may blackmail the parent. They may cause them to be so worried that the parent feels like they can't set limits. And parents do have to be able to do both to show empathy and love and compassion for the mentally ill child, but also to set limits on behavior so that they're not being abused or disrespected or taken advantage of.
Oh, absolutely. And I will say too that because we are seeing more people seek, therapy, people are being diagnosed properly as before it just was so and so has a
Mhm.
problem.
Right. Yeah,
So
exactly.
there is some hope there. The other thing that
Mhm.
you talk about as well is narcissism, because this is a hot word that is overly used all over the place,
Yeah.
and also being discussed a lot in a therapist's office. So let's say, for instance, adult child goes in for therapy and is talking about their childhood, and somewhere along the way, the therapist says, I think your mother is a narcissist,
Hmm.
given what you're telling me. So we're seeing kind of like secondhand diagnosis. What do you think about that? Because I've seen that happen, and then that adult is like really uncomfortable now with how they look at that parent in a relationship and find themselves distancing from them.
Yeah, I think it's sadly common that therapists overdiagnose parents, and as a result, it kind of justifies the adult child either not trying or feeling hopeless or feeling like the parent's beyond redemption. And I think so much of what should be considered kind of normal parental concern or involvement or even intrusion gets diagnosed as narcissism. And I think in part that results from the fact that parents have become much more involved than prior generations were. Parents in the past 4 decades are spending much more time with their children than they did, say, in the early 1980s and before. There's been a 40% reduction in outdoor play. Parents are much more anxious about the future that their children are going to inherit. They're much more guilt-ridden because they're constantly being told on the internet that there must be some other better way that they're raising their children than they're not. So the effect of all of that is to kind of heat up the domestic household. And when it works really well. Statistically, more parents are close to their adult children than they were in prior generations. And I think it's in part because parents have become more sophisticated, more educated about what good child rearing looks like. So there are more adult children feeling closer to their parents than in prior generations. But it can also backfire. That high level of involvement can cause the adult child to feel intruded on, to feel controlled, to feel like the parent wants much more of them than they want. So the request that I hear the most from adult children is, I want you to respect my boundaries. You're violating my boundaries.
Mm.
And I think that has to do with this way that the family household has become much more intensified.
I could not agree with you more. And certainly under the current, past year, that's really intensified. And even in situations where people have lost their jobs and have had to move back in with their parents, with their family. So
Mhm. Right.
could, and then the whole notion of boundaries, and that again is something, that term that people are going to use more frequently than ever before. I do
Hmm.
find it kind of be interesting because other generations is like, boundaries. What do you mean
Right.
boundaries?
Well, right. And
um,
cultures too. There are plenty of cultures where the whole idea of boundaries seems sort of silly because they're not really thinking so much about the individual. They're thinking much more of the group identity or the family as a unit. So the idea of
yeah,
the child not respecting their boundaries is sort of a foreign idea, literally in this case.
absolutely. Another thing you talk about as well is flashpoints, and you have them as gender identity, sexuality, religion, politics, and personality clashes. And I
Yep.
can't say how relevant that is. The
Yeah.
gender identity piece, people coming out at or choosing to be that, you know, different within their family that they grew up as, the sexuality part as well.
Hmm.
I was watching HGTV the other day and we had a thruple on there, looking for a house on House Hunters. And I was like, well, I've never heard of this,
That's in yeah. I
and
just heard that term too recently. I never heard it before. So no, it's a
yes,
thing,
it was,
right?
and they were looking for a house. And then the other one too with religion. A lot of people of my generation are again that a la carte. I like this. I am spiritual but not religious, and kind of going away these traditional belief systems and having
Hmm.
intermarriage
Yep.
or just foregoing it all together. And politics, I mean, my goodness, talk about a field of landmines, um, that, and not just seeing it with parents, but a variety of extended family members. And I even had a friend who is gay, and him and his partner are very much supported by his family. However, his family during the political system or during the last election were very avid Trump supporters, and that
Hmm.
really caused a huge rift between this child who thought that he was supported by this family, his parents, but now they're really wanting to support someone who's in opposition, and
Yeah.
seeing things like that happen. Or also, I didn't realize my cousin thought that way, and making
Hmm.
people um, really kind of take inventory of what their extended families' values and beliefs are based on that. And then
Yeah.
obviously personality clashes. I mean, and as much as we, love our children, they are not exactly like us. And they're not
No,
going to like
sometimes
the
they're
same
radically
things.
that's right. Sometimes they're radically different. Yeah, the political piece is interesting because today politics is the strongest value in terms of how people think of themselves and think of others. And so, we've always had political differences, but it's really only in the past 10 to 15 years or so that it's become such a powerful identity divide where people, look at people from the other political side as being really the enemy. It's not just a difference, it's somebody that they feel contempt, hatred, aggression towards clearly. So when if you're in a family and the parents vote one way and the adult child votes another way, that's a big problem. But what you were saying before in terms of gender identity, I am working increasingly with families where the child switches gender from, say they were raised as a girl, but then they reach adolescence and they want to be a boy. They want to have surgery or take hormones. In some cases, the parents have known all along, but it's also not terribly uncommon that it doesn't happen until post adolescence. And it can be a big problem, particularly if the parents don't immediately rally behind that desire to switch genders and become completely supportive. Then the parents can be viewed as being transphobic, which clearly some may be, but not every parent who says, "Well, are you sure? Let's take your time," or "That's a big decision," or something like that. That doesn't necessarily mean the parents transphobic. They may just be scared or worried or cautious or wanting the child to have all the best information before switching. So that can be a big cause of an eventual estrangement. But as you said, personality clashes. You're right. Parents and adult children, parents, they can be very, very, very different. And sometimes, kids can feel like I, would never choose my parents, and parents might say, well, I would never choose my child. Somehow we all ended up being in the same family. So that just sometimes happens.
Well, and it can also be that maybe the new spouse of the parent has a
Mm,
personality clash with one of their children. I've
mhm,
certainly seen that, or
mm,
it just doesn't jive. I mean, we certainly have, connections. All of us have connections with different kinds of people all the time over a variety of
yeah.
different interests. But the other thing
Hmm.
that you're talking about with gender identity is there is grief involved,
Is
that
what?
that dream, maybe your child that was born a girl may go to have children, of her
Hmm.
own, and
Yeah.
you know, for some people that dream taken from them and the grief involved,
Right.
and all those different things that you talk about in terms of flashpoints, you know, they
Hmm.
they do there is grief kind of involved in all of them. Maybe
Yeah.
you were really close with an aunt, and now that they are on the other side of the fence in terms of politics or what have you, you feel a sense of loss because maybe you were very
Mm,
close.
sure. Yeah, sometimes often our feelings of closeness are predicated on feelings similar to people that we love and care about. And if somebody takes a serious change in direction and in whatever way, it can feel like either an abandonment of the self or some other kind of an experience that feels more disruptive than unifying. So I think that can be true.
Absolutely. And the other thing too that you address are the child-in-law. So like the son or daughter-in-law, and
Yeah.
how that can create a lot of division. And you call it the cult of one. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because it's very interesting.
Yeah, it's very common that estrangements come because of who the child marries. Now, sometimes it's because the parent kind of steps in it and is critical of that new husband or wife, but sometimes the parents are perfectly fine, and that new husband or wife is more troubled, and they basically tell the adult child, "Choose them or me. You can't have both." And I call it the cult of one because that person will let the adult child into their family or their family system and close the door behind them and encourage that son or daughter to basically renounce their ties to everybody. So they're no longer allowed to have any friends that they used to be friends with, siblings, aunts, uncles, grandparents, parents. So that's what I mean by a cult of one, and it's sadly quite common.
Now, why does that happen? Why is there such a sense of um, I don't even know what you would call it, but it's like your fear. Why is there so
Mhm.
much? That's how I take it. But why? Why does that happen?
When you say fear, do you mean fear on who's part of the cult of one initiator?
Let's say I'm just going to throw out an example, a daughter-in-law who is like, okay, I'm married to this person and now I want nothing to do with your family. It's going to be
Hmm.
all about my family and what we
Yeah.
do and all of that. Just completely, you know, um, almost having that person estrange themselves. And it may not even be willful. It's just that they feel like there's no choice because they have this, wife, and let's say the son-in-law has a wife and they have a whole family, and I mean, they don't want to break that up for the sake of their parents. So why does that happen? It just seems so radical.
Yeah, well, it is pretty radical. I mean, I think a son-in-law or a daughter-in-law who would basically tell their spouse, choose them or me. That I would assume it's somebody who has a um, kind of a small pie feeling towards life. That if there's not very much to go around, and you have to kind of make sure that you get enough. It may be somebody who grew up feeling very deprived psychologically, so he or she may feel like if they, there's not enough to share with the parents, and if they don't really just kind of keep that person all to themselves, and somehow there's not going to be enough for them. There may be a kind of a paranoia that underlies it, a worry that if other people stay close to their new husband or wife, that they'll unduly influence them against that person. But then there's the other question about why would a son or daughter allow themselves to be manipulated by that. Now, in my clinical experience, sons are more vulnerable to it. I think for a variety of reasons. One, daughters tend to be closer to their mothers, so they have power in that sense. I think men are also easy to manipulate around their masculinity. So if a wife were to go, "Oh, well, you're just being such a mama's boy, I'm your family now, or we're your family. You need to prioritize me." I think if the husband has the son has his own needs to separate from the parents, he can use that as kind of a launching pad to do that. And finally, for most men, their wives are their best friends, if not their only friends. So they may pay a really high price if they don't go along with the wife's desires.
That's a really interesting point, or all of them are really interesting points. And from what I've seen working with primarily older adults, is that the daughter in law really holds the key to
Hmm.
them having access to their son as well as their grandchildren.
Yeah, no, that's
Um,
the case. Yeah.
and, kind of piggybacking on this, when there are grandchildren involved, and then that withholding of, being able to have access to them and almost using them as a pawn, what can you say about that type of situation?
Well, from a strategic standpoint, I think that the estranged grandparents have to recognize that the new son-in-law or daughter-in-law is the new alpha. So you can't go around them; you have to go through them. And sometimes one of the big sources of strategy or solution, my method is for the parent to write an amends letter to the adult child, where they try to address in a very apologetic way the complaints that the adult child has, to find the kernel of truth, to assume that there's some basis of fact in what the child is objecting to. But if they think that the son-in-law or daughter-in-law is the cause, then they have to do some kind of an amends letter to them as well, because they have the power, they have the keys to the kingdom. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that the son-in-law or daughter-in-law is going to relent and open the door, but it can strengthen the spine of their son or daughter. It can cause them to say, well, look, my parents are trying. They wrote this really good letter. I think that they're sincere. Let's give them a chance. Otherwise, if the son-in-law or daughter-in-law is really motivated to keep the door shut, they can say something like, well, your parents aren't even trying. So, they never even apologize to me, even if there's not clearly something that they should
Mm.
apologize for.
Oh, absolutely. And I've certainly seen that for sure. And it's really
Mm.
unfortunate because, as people are living longer and able to see, their grandchildren grow up to be adults and in some cases have their own children,
Right?
those children are really missing out on having that wisdom and, more love to go around by having them near them.
That's
Um,
true.
and
It's a big loss for
I
everybody.
mean, absolutely. I can say from my own experience with my in laws, they are absolutely cherished members within our family. For
Mm.
my boys having, just an extra set of ears that maybe
Yeah.
they don't want
Yeah.
to talk to their parents.
Mhm.
um,
Exactly.
but then, even as a couple, having that wisdom to be shared
Mhm.
as an older couple, been there, done it, seen it all, and
Mhm.
has under their belt to share that. I mean, it's very enriching, and I hope that people recognize that in time. But
Yeah.
um,
Well, also that just
going
because if
okay,
just because you're an adult child and you don't get along with your parents doesn't mean that your children don't like your parents. There's some people that maybe they weren't great parents, but they're still great grandparents, or the grandchildren are really attached to the grandparents, even if the parents have problems with them, and it just suddenly cut out a very involved grandchild. grandparent from a grandchild's life is traumatizing and hurtful, not only to the grandparent, but also to the grandchild. And so many of the grandparents in my practice say, it's hard. It's certainly hard not having contact with my adult child, but in some ways it's even harder not having contact with my grandchildren because it's such a pure kind of relationship. So when that's taken away from them, it's just such a powerful and profound feeling of loss that it's very hard for them to make sense out of.
Absolutely. And the other thing that I've seen too are adult children seeing how wonderful their parents are being with their children and just being full of all this love and patience and all these things that they may not have experienced growing up. It can be very triggering for them, maybe even
Hmm.
resentment around that.
Sure.
Um, and what would you say about someone who was dealing with that?
Yeah, I think that you're putting your finger on something that for some adult children, if they see their parents being much more affectionate and patient and loving with their children, with the grandchildren, you're right. They may feel feelings of envy or jealousy or resentment, kind of like, oh well, you can do it now, but you couldn't do it when I was younger. But on the other hand, for some, it's actually therapeutic. It's kind of like, all right, well, you couldn't give it to me when I was younger, but you are able to give it to my children, and that counts for something. And I think for grandparents who know that they weren't particularly good parents, it can be very healing for them to be able to be better grandparents than they were parents. And so for them, it's also a double loss if that opportunity is being pulled away. Not only is there the loss of that relationship with the grandchild, there's also the loss of that experience of repair, which can also be psychologically very important.
Hmm. And, something that we kind of talked about a little bit earlier is that, when adult children look at their parents, there is some point where you're like, wow, they're a normal person. They are a
Right.
person. They're not just a
Hmm.
parent. And they're
Right.
flawed and they
Hmm.
may have done things in a way that you don't agree with or you would certainly do differently. Um,
Yeah.
but in previous generations, it doesn't really seem like there was as much questioning around that. It was more of a, well, they do it that way and whatever, that's
Right.
just how they are. But
Right.
with, the younger generations, it just seems like there is, in seeing that their parent is flawed, that maybe that is creating more of the ability to estrange from them or giving them
Hmm.
a reason to. Um, I don't know, just kind of a thought there.
Yeah. No. No. I think you're right that parents have become too important in the minds of younger generations. It's sort of too determinative in terms of outcome. Like, well, if I come into adulthood and I have depression or anxiety or low self esteem or problems with relationships, well, it's got to be something that my parent or parents did. Well, yeah, maybe it was, but maybe it's something else. But if we live in a culture where everything gets blamed on parents, then it's easy for the adult child to reject the parent as saying, "Well, you failed me as a child raising me because you didn't attend to me in these kinds of ways that I clearly needed, so I don't owe you anything." And I just think that's a very problematic way to run a society. It doesn't
It's
really invite the
very,
kind of compassion for the parent that parents deserve. Parents genuinely do the
mhm.
best they can given what they know how to do. And sometimes that is terrible, right? There are abusive parents, but even there,
Yeah.
they're doing the best that they know how to do given what they know. So, I think ideally as a culture, we would encourage more compassion and a well-rounded view of parents rather than this idea that parents deserve to be estranged if they didn't raise the child in a way they feel like they deserve to be raised.
Well, and you can't give what you don't have, you
Right.
know,
That's true. Hmm.
and And I think for a lot of people, at least in what I've seen, is when you have a parent that's more, maybe displayed more of an avoidant attachment, that
Hmm.
can be very confusing or feeling anxious, have the adult child having anxious attachment in their other relationships because of
Mhm.
that, because there's no real reinforcement of that love and connection. But that's a whole nother topic.
It
Um,
is, yeah.
also, talking about siblings. So, we aren't, families aren't as large as they used to be. So, most
Right.
families are having two kids. So, when they have those two kids and they are estranged, which is happening more and more, what do families do, or what do they experience, and how do they handle that?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of parents feel like there's something that they could do or should do to bring the siblings together. I think moms in particular feel that way. And the reality is, there's not very much a parent can do to bring siblings together who don't want to be together. The difference between reconciling from a parent to an adult child and a sibling is that parents are highly motivated to do the work that I recommend that they have to do in order to reconcile with their adult child, to learn how to take responsibility, to show empathy, to show compassion for the adult child, to write an amends letter, to not get defensive, to not explain, to get angry back. There's a bunch of things parents can do, and they're willing to do it, most of them, because they're in so much pain not having the adult child in their lives. And typically, if there is an estrangement, it's the adult child that did the estranging, not the parent, because for the adult child, it may be linked to an act of growth or self esteem or identity or pursuing happiness, whereas for the parent, it's pretty much all downside. So somebody's got to take the big initiative, and typically it's on parents to do that. For siblings, it's easy for siblings to get stalemated, for them to feel like, no, you make the first move, and to feel like I'm not gonna make a big effort here, particularly if there's long-standing sibling rivalries and resentments and the like, and hurts. So parents can certainly encourage the adult children reaching out to each other, but they have relatively little power to do that. And so parents sometimes think they have much more power than they really do.
Hmm. Yeah, I have definitely seen that, and it is very complicated.
Hmm.
And I do think, like what you're saying, parents are kind of at a loss with that, especially when they are adults. I mean, there's only so much that um, and I've also seen too that parents will try to, and a child, let's say in a family unit, they were always the peacekeeper. Like that's what their role was. You're to keep the peace. So in this situation, you need to make amends with so
Right.
and
Yeah.
so forth, no matter how dysfunctional it is.
Hmm.
Even if everyone's all together again, it doesn't make it
Yeah.
good. Um,
Right.
but another topic that you cover that I find really interesting is wills. So wills and inheritance. So let's say, a family does have something for their children to inherit, but they haven't talked to these kids in a long time. Should they
Hmm.
still have them a part of that? Um, if they don't, is that okay? What do you think
Hmm.
about that?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of parents cutting their children out of the will. So a lot of parents say to me, "Well, I don't owe this kid anything. They haven't talked to me in several years. They cut me out of my grandchildren's lives. Why should they be rewarded for that?" And I think that really misunderstands what adult children are doing when they cut a parent off. In the same way that parents do the best that they can raising their children, I think that adult children do the best that they can, even if they're cutting off the parent, even as miserable as that makes the parent. And so, from me, my perspective of the will is, what do you want your living legacy to be? Do you want it to be that you rejected your child because they rejected you, or do you want your final message to be one of love and compassion and empathy? A. B. If you have multiple children and you cut out one child from the will, you're kind of setting them up to either have a lawsuit with the others or some other kind of problems with the others. And so I just feel like it's problematic in a lot of different ways. So I'm not a big fan of parents cutting children out of the wills.
Well, and I have to say, I'm surprised by your response because it is kind of
Mm.
contradictory to what a lot of parents do you feel? You know,
Hmm.
like what you're saying, what do I owe this child? Or a
Right.
feeling that there is a trust issue. So let's say a family having for their children to inherit, but maybe their son is still with that daughter-in-law that kept them away,
Hmm.
and they don't want their hard-earned money to go towards, you know, providing more luxury for her lifestyle or what have you, because you certainly do hear of that.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I'd be like, well, yeah, I can totally see how you feel. um,
Yeah.
but you're saying more keeping it on the basis of the living legacy.
Well, I mean, some of these things are estate planning, right? If you have a mentally ill kid, you're not just necessarily going to leave them tons of money. You might have to have a third party to manage it. Similarly, if you don't want your son-in-law or daughter-in-law to inherit, if the couple divorces, you can set up the estate that way. But let's look at some of the common reasons that an adult child estranges themselves. One is they're mentally ill. Do we really want to punish mentally ill children for estranging themselves if they didn't know how to do it any better? Second of all, even the kid who's being manipulated by the son-in-law or daughter-in-law, if they could do it any better, they would. Sometimes adult children estrange themselves because they don't know any other way to feel separate. Sometimes it's a result of a divorce where one parent poisons the child against the other. I just think that punishing people for these kinds of acts, I just, to me, it's not a good parental decision. I think we want to think about wills from a perspective of legacy. So that's where I plant my feet in this.
Well, and I think that that's really important because, again, it's contrary to where people naturally. And so it really offers a different perspective, one that is broader and um, certainly more of the legacy aspect as opposed to what is happening right now and just focusing on yourself and your own pain.
Right.
But,
Hmm.
with everything that we've covered, all of these different topics, how do we begin to heal? Where do we find the solutions? Is it even realistic to have hope? What do you think about these things?
Well, if you're the parent, your child's cut off from you. I think there's a lot of things that you can do. I mean, like with so much about family life, there's no guarantees that any one particular intervention will work. But I think starting by writing a really good amends letter where you take responsibility and you're not defensive and you don't explain, and you find the kernel of truth in what your child's complaints are. In my own research, that was one of the most powerful things that parents can do. Taking guilt off the table is also very important. That ship has kind of sailed. In prior generations, it's kind of okay to guilt trip your kids into contact. That's no longer the case. Sort of acknowledging that your adult child has the power to not have you in their life if they don't want it and want you in their life means that parents do have to try harder to understand the child's perspective and to show empathy for it. So that's really the core of my therapeutic approach around these problems.
Well, and you also provide workshops and things like that for families. Is that right?
That's true. Yeah, I have a free Q&A on every Monday at 11:30 Pacific, and so you can uh, access that by joining my free newsletter for estranged parents at my website www.drjoshuacoleman.com. I'm also, if you're a therapist or you're interested in training in this, I've started a new training program with a British woman, Becca Bland, who's a journalist and researcher. She's estranged from her parents, so we have both
Mm.
generations and both perspectives. It's called StatingTogether.net. Every Tuesday, I have a webinars for estranged parents. So there's a lot that I'm doing in this space because it's a very complex problem, as you're pointing out, Nicolette. So there's a big need, and I'm hoping to bring as much complexity to the topic as possible.
Well, and it's certainly it's one thing for someone to share that with you from just their, professional experience, but it's another to have that person come with their personal experience and
Mhm.
that you are someone that has, seen the other side,
Yeah,
and that it is possible. And your situation is one that a lot of people certainly have, dealt with in their lives or are currently dealing with. And so I think that's really
yeah,
powerful. And to me, it sounds like it's a labor of love, you know,
it is. Yeah,
to
it's
share
definitely
that.
a mission. Yeah, having been through it, like just helping one parent to reunite with their child is deeply meaningful. And having been through it, I can really empathize with any other parent or grandparent who's going through it. So it's definitely a mission.
So, as our show comes to an end, what are some final words of wisdom that you would like to leave with our audience?
Well, I've talked a lot about strategies, but the other message is really to practice self compassion. That it's very easy if your adult child stops talking to you to feel profound feelings of shame and loss and regret and guilt and feeling terrible, even if you think that your child isn't justified in doing it. It's really important to get support, to talk to other estranged parents. I've got a private Facebook group for estranged grandparents and parents that you can find on my website or to read about it, to not feel alone with it. Because every time I do national media on this topic, I get letters from estranged parents saying, gosh, I thought I was the only one. Because people don't talk about it because they feel like it's such a shameful topic. So I think really learning how to practice self compassion and self forgiveness are really two of the most critical things you can do if you're an estranged parent.
I think that is awesome advice. And we will have Dr. Joshua's information at the end of this program, and you'll be able to find him online. Thank you
Great.
so much for being with us today, Dr. Joshua Coleman. You have been an absolute pleasure. I can't
Well,
thank you
thank you.
enough, and I know many people that can certainly utilize your message and all of your information.
Well, thank you, Nicolette. It was a pleasure.
As you have learned today, if any of you are experiencing family estrangement, you are certainly not alone. Many people are dealing with this silent epidemic as well. I hope that you are able to take from this program new thoughts, ways to heal, and certainly the courage to maybe make amends with those family members that are estranged from you. And hopefully, you find healing once again. I'm your host, Nicolette Hume. Thank you so much for being a part of our community today. I look forward to next time when we can be together again. Until next time, always be kind, be safe, and certainly stay curious. Take care.